Chicago, 1871. A catastrophe that old world/Tartaria circles treat as more than a fire. The claim: multiple cities burned in sync, and the past was rewritten in the ash. I'm tracing the record, archive by archive, to separate period sources from later overlays. Like, subscribe and drop your theory below. Chicago burned in October 1871. Entire blocks collapsed into ash. In old world circles, this is not treated as accident but as rupture. The claim is simple and severe. Multiple cities ignited within the same window, and what followed was not recovery but replacement, a reset, a controlled erasure. On the same dates, Peshtigo burned in Wisconsin. Towns in Michigan caught fire. The map lights up in the same week. For some, that cluster is the first signal, not coincidence, coordination. The suggestion repeats: too many cities, too aligned, too complete. Something was being cleared. Within Tartaria discourse, 1871 becomes a pivot. The fires are framed as the moment a previous civilization was removed from view. Photographs of melted metal circulate as evidence. Newspaper phrases like "fire from the sky" are quoted without context. The destruction is read as demolition. The rebuilding is read as overwriting. The narrative continues. Ornate 19th century architecture did not originate in the 19th century. It was inherited. After the fires, the story goes, cities were reorganized and assigned new origins. Street grids adjusted, ownership shifted, archives corrected. The record, according to the claim, was edited at scale. But the archive begins earlier. Local newspapers from October 1871 describe drought conditions across the Midwest, weeks without rain, wooden sidewalks, lumber yards stacked tight against rail lines, wind gusts recorded in city reports, insurance ledgers listing block after block as total loss. The language is catastrophic but terrestrial. Sparks, embers, gale. The Chicago daily papers speak of barn fires, rail yards, and an overwhelmed fire brigade. Insurance bulletins list claims in columns. Municipal reports outline new building codes requiring brick and stone. There is no mention of Tartaria, no language of civilizational replacement. Only property, debt, rebuilding schedules. The silence matters. In the sources we can verify, the fires are disasters of infrastructure and weather. Peshtigo accounts describe forests left to dry, farmers clearing land, flames merging into a firestorm. Survivors recount heat so intense that rivers boiled at the surface. These details later reappear online, detached from their forestry context. The phrase "melted metal" circulates widely now. In period reports, references to warped iron and collapsed foundries appear in industrial damage assessments. Extreme heat in dense wooden districts can reach temperatures sufficient to deform structural elements. The archive records damage. It does not record an intentional purge, yet the pattern remains compelling. Multiple fires, same week, massive loss, reconstruction that reshaped skylines. Chicago's rebuilding introduced stricter codes and new architectural ambition. Stone replaced timber. Steel began to dominate. To a modern viewer, before and after imagery resembles replacement rather than repair. The reset framing depends on that visual rupture. Photographs of ruins are paired with later images of grand boulevards. The contrast becomes argument. Order emerging from ash is interpreted as evidence of a prior system removed. But in City Council minutes from 1872, The focus is practical: drainage, materials, fire limits, loan approvals. If 1871 marked the fall of Tartaria, the contemporary record does not say so. What it does show is scale: economic shock, insurance collapse, legislative response. The fires are described as the worst in living memory. The tone is apocalyptic but grounded. There is no hidden vocabulary in the margins. So, the investigation begins here, not with the ruins, but with the paper trail: newspapers, insurance registries, city permit ledgers, architectural journals from the 1870s. We trace backward from the modern claim to the earliest traceable mention. If 1871 was a reset, the record should shift. If it does not, the overlay may have come later. Multiple cities burned. That fact stands. The question is not whether the destruction occurred. It did. The question is when the destruction became something else in the telling. When catastrophe turned into coordination. When fire became reset. The archive holds its version. The modern narrative holds another. The distance between them is where this inquiry begins. The record we can touch starts with ordinary things: ink, columns, timetables. In October 1871, the first layer is not myth, it is accounting. A local newspaper notice, 1870s, a municipal report, 1872, an insurance ledger entry, week of the fire. The archive is blunt. It counts what burned. Chicago's papers describe heat, wind, and the spread through wooden districts. Headlines emphasize ruin, but the body text circles practical causes: dry weather, roof shingles, lumber yards, fire lines that failed. In city documents, the language shifts to policy, brick requirements, fire limits, street widening, funding. This is not glamorous. That is the point. If a reset narrative was present in 1871, it should leave a trace in the period vocabulary. Not Tartaria, necessarily, but a pattern of claims about deliberate ignition, coordinated demolition, or erased origins. So, we look for anchors: court proceedings, coroner summaries, state investigations, railroad inquiries, even rumor columns. The archive has room for panic. It usually records it. What we consistently see is blame without conspiracy. In Chicago, the popular story attaches to a barn and a cow. It becomes folklore because it is simple, not because it is proven. Official inquiries did not settle on a single cause. Newspapers from the period admit uncertainty. They argue over sparks, negligence, and chance. They do not describe a planned citywide purge. Peshtigo's surviving accounts, gathered later but rooted in first-hand testimony, describe a firestorm driven by forestry conditions, slash piles, clearing burns, a dry season, wind, heat that suffocated, darkness at midday. The detail is violent, but the mechanism is local and physical. These testimonies are often mined for lines that sound cosmic. In the record, they are meteorology and fuel load. Now, the key test. Do period sources describe fire from the sky? Sometimes they use that phrase. But in the 19th century press, it is often metaphor. It can refer to embers carried by wind. It can be poetic shorthand for a sky filled with sparks. Without the surrounding paragraph, a metaphor becomes a weapon. This is where reinterpretation begins. Melted metal appears as well, but usually as damage assessment. Foundries warped, rails bent, iron fixtures twisted by heat. In an industrial city with dense fuel and confined streets, extreme temperatures are expected. The archive calls it extraordinary. It does not call it impossible. It does not assign it to an outside force. Reset advocates also point to speed and scale of rebuilding. Here the record gets specific. Chicago issued permits. Contractors listed materials. Architectural journals discussed fireproof construction, not hidden inheritance. Banking notices tracked loans. Insurance firms failed, merged, restructured. This is a paper storm. It is not an empty space. Another claim is that grand architecture cannot be a post-1871 product. But architectural periodicals from the 1870s and 1880s document design trends, materials, and names. They argue about style, cost, and engineering. They print drawings. They advertise stone suppliers. These are not secret documents. They are public trade culture. So why does the reset framing feel persuasive? Because the visual record is brutal. Before and after images collapse time. A skyline becomes a single switch, but the written record shows continuity. The same city councils, the same property disputes, the same street names reappearing in rebuilding ordinances, the same tax rolls updated, not replaced. There is also silence, but it is a different kind. The archive rarely preserves the voices of the poorest residents. It preserves institutions. That gap can be mistaken for deletion. Yet, gaps are normal in bureaucratic record-keeping. Absence is not automatically erasure. It is a missing shelf, not a sealed vault. At this stage, the record we can verify does not support a coordinated reset. It supports a chain of conditions that made catastrophe likely: drought, timber, wind, land-clearing fires, under-resourced response. Afterward, policy, finance, and rebuilding. The myth does not begin in 1871 documents. If it begins anywhere, it begins later, when fragments are lifted, cropped, and replayed. One more anchor. Library catalog entries and city directories, 1870s onward. They list churches, hotels, factories, owners, addresses. They show what reopened, what moved, what vanished for mundane reasons. A rebuilt block leaves paperwork like footprints in wet cement. If a prior layer was reassigned, we would expect discontinuities, sudden renaming without notice, mass replacement of lots without transactions, a public argument over origin. Instead, the record looks bureaucratic and noisy. So the next question tightens. If Tartaria is not in the period file, when does it enter the folder? When do Chicago and Peshtigo stop being disasters and start becoming evidence? The first trace of that shift is what we hunt next. The shift does not appear in 1871. It surfaces decades later and then accelerates online. Early 20th century histories of the Chicago fire focus on urban planning, insurance collapse, and rebuilding. Mid-century commemorations repeat the same frame. No Tartaria, no reset. The pattern remains industrial disaster and civic response. The record is stable. The modern link between 1871 and Tartaria begins to coalesce in digital forums. Blog posts from the early 2000s speculate about lost empires and inherited architecture. Image boards recycle engravings of ornate 19th century buildings. Photographs of ruins are juxtaposed with later boulevards. The contrast becomes argument. A template forms. Around the 2000s, video platforms amplify the cluster. The same phrases recur: coordinated fires, melted steel, orphan trains, world fairs, reset. Chicago 1871 becomes a fixed node in a broader Old World map. The fires are no longer isolated events. They are framed as synchronized signals in a global clearing. Notice the repetition pattern. A claim appears. It is paired with dramatic imagery. A period quote is extracted. Context is trimmed. The quote circulates as proof. The next creator references the previous one. Citations point sideways, not backward. The archive is replaced by screenshots. The paper trail becomes a loop. Geography expands in the telling. Chicago is linked to Peshtigo, then to other fires that same year, then to unrelated disasters in different decades. Proximity becomes coordination. Temporal clustering becomes intention. The narrative benefits from scale. The larger the map, the stronger the impression of design. Another feature emerges: architectural skepticism. Grand facades from the 1870s and 1880s are labeled too advanced. Construction timelines are questioned. Photographs are examined for anomalies. Yet trade journals from the period document engineers, contractors, materials, and budgets in detail. These sources are rarely cited in reset discussions. They are less cinematic. The language of erasure also stabilizes. Rewritten, reassigned, buried. These words are powerful because they imply deliberate action. But when we trace them backward, they lead to modern commentary, not 19th century print. The archive does not use this vocabulary for 1871. The vocabulary enters later, then attaches itself retroactively. There is a psychological layer. Catastrophe invites narrative. A fire that reshapes a skyline feels like a chapter break. Humans prefer intention to accident. Multiple fires in 1 week feel like pattern, even when meteorology and land use practices offer explanations. The reset frame supplies coherence. It connects disparate events into a single arc. We also observe algorithmic reinforcement. Videos that frame 1871 as a reset often cross-reference world fairs, orphan trains, and maps labeled Tartaria. The cluster strengthens through association. A viewer enters through one topic and encounters another. Over time, Chicago 1871 becomes a ritual reference point. The year itself carries charge, but when we return to primary materials, municipal minutes, insurance audits, engineering journals, the continuity remains bureaucratic. Names persist. Parcels transfer through recorded transactions. Building codes evolve incrementally. The city expands along documented lines. The archive does not show a break in institutional identity. It shows stress and adaptation. The spread pattern reveals something important. The claim grows through reinterpretation, not through newly discovered 1871 documents. No sealed vault opens. No suppressed ledger surfaces. Instead, existing material is recontextualized. Photographs are reframed. Metaphors are literalized. Absences are amplified. This does not invalidate curiosity. It clarifies chronology. The reset interpretation belongs to a modern discourse environment. The fires belong to 1871. The two intersect in the 21st century, not in the original files. The record, when traced, shows where the merge occurs. So, we arrive at the edge. The catastrophe is real. The destruction is documented. The reconstruction is visible. The Tartaria link, however, appears after the fact. The question that remains is narrower and sharper. What survives if we strip away the overlay and hold only what the paper trail can support? That is where we turn next. What survives the record is not mystery, it is density. October 1871 was a convergence of conditions: drought across the Midwest, wooden infrastructure, expanding rail networks, land clearing through controlled burns that escaped control. These factors are documented in agricultural reports and local press. They form a pattern of vulnerability, not coordination. Chicago's municipal files from the years immediately after the fire show administrative continuity, the same council structures, the same legal frameworks, ordinances amended, not replaced wholesale, building codes tightened, materials regulated, insurance markets recalibrated. The city's institutional spine remains visible. It bends. It does not vanish. Property transactions provide another anchor. Deeds recorded, parcels reassigned through sale, not silent confiscation. Court records reflect disputes over insurance claims and reconstruction contracts. These are slow, procedural conflicts. They leave signatures in the archive. A civilizational reset would likely disrupt this continuity at scale. The paperwork does not show that rupture. Architectural journals from the 1870s and 1880s describe new construction methods in response to fire risk: fireproofing experiments, iron framing, masonry thickness standards. Engineers debate load-bearing limits. These publications name architects and contractors. They argue about cost overruns. They do not describe inheriting structures from a lost empire. They describe building. Even the visual record, often used as reset evidence, supports incremental change. Photographs taken in the months after the fire show temporary wooden structures erected for commerce. Later images show gradual stone replacement. The skyline evolves over years, not overnight. The transformation is dramatic, but it is phased and recorded. The phrase, "the record shifts," implies a detectable break. In 1871 documentation, we do not observe that break in language, governance, or ownership patterns. We observe crisis response, financial strain, urban redesign influenced by catastrophe. These are profound changes, yet they occur within traceable civic processes. None of this erases the scale of destruction. Thousands of buildings gone, communities displaced, trauma embedded in survivor accounts. Catastrophe can feel like the end of a world. That emotional truth feeds the reset interpretation. But emotional intensity does not equal archival confirmation. The Tartaria framework enters as a lens applied later. It reframes destruction as deliberate erasure. It reframes rebuilding as concealment. Once that lens is applied, ordinary bureaucratic adjustments appear suspicious. Code revisions look like rewriting history. Urban planning looks like masking origins. The overlay reshapes perception without altering the original files. So, what remains, stripped of overlay? A cluster of fires in a dry season. Institutional responses recorded in municipal and trade documents. Visual evidence of devastation and gradual reconstruction. No contemporary trace of a coordinated purge tied to a lost global empire. The archive holds catastrophe. It does not hold Tartaria. The distance between disaster and reset narrative is measurable in time. One belongs to 1871 records. The other belongs to modern reinterpretation. The two intersect only when later discourse reaches backward and assigns new meaning to old pages. Multiple cities burned, that is documented. Buildings were rebuilt under stricter codes, that is documented. A prior civilization was erased in a coordinated event. That claim does not appear in the 19th century paper trail we can verify. The investigation does not close with certainty. It closes with boundaries. Here is what the archive contains. Here is what it does not. Beyond that line, interpretation begins. The record remains where it has always been. Ink on paper, dated, specific, silent on Tartaria, loud on fire.